Charles Bennett, a successful businessman, boards a first-class flight expecting a peaceful journey. But when a flight attendant questions his identity, everything changes in an instant. What happens next will leave you speechless. Tell us where you're watching from today. We love hearing from you. Charles stepped onto the plane with the quiet confidence of a man used to moving through exclusive spaces. The hum of the first-class cabin surrounded him, soft conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the rustle of newspapers. Settling into his plush seat, he placed his leather briefcase beside him, his fingers briefly tracing the embossed initials. This seat, this space, was his, earned through years of hard work and perseverance. Rebecca Miller, the flight attendant, approached with a rehearsed smile that barely concealed her skepticism. Her eyes flickered over him, taking in his dark, tailored suit and the quiet dignity he carried. Something in her gaze made Charles shift slightly, sensing the storm before it arrived. "Sir," she said, her tone professional but tinged with an unmistakable edge. "Can I see your boarding pass again?" Charles looked up, calm but questioning. "Of course," he replied smoothly, retrieving the pass from his pocket and handing it to her. He watched her eyes scan the document, her brow creasing slightly. "This seat is for first-class passengers only," she said, emphasizing each word as if explaining a complex concept. Charles raised an eyebrow, offering a patient smile. "And that's exactly what I am." Rebecca hesitated, holding the ticket longer than necessary as if waiting for it to change before her eyes. Passengers nearby stole glances, their curiosity piqued by the growing tension. "I'll have to verify this with my supervisor," she finally said, her voice laced with forced authority. Before he could respond, she turned sharply, walking down the aisle with brisk steps. Charles exhaled, settling back in his seat, his gaze fixed on the window. He had faced this before, the silent questioning of his presence in spaces where some believed he didn't belong. Yet here he was again. Charles remained seated, his fingers drumming lightly against the armrest as he gazed out the window. The familiar skyline of New York was now just a blur beneath the clouds. But the weight of the stairs inside the cabin was sharp and present. He could feel them, judging, questioning, assuming. He shifted slightly, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt, a habit he developed over the years to steady himself in moments like this. Rebecca returned, this time with a senior flight attendant in tow. The man, tall with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, approached with an air of polite formality. "Sir, I'm sorry to disturb you," he said, his voice smooth but wary. "There seems to be some confusion regarding your seat." Charles met his gaze, his expression calm but firm. "I don't see any confusion, unless there's an issue with my boarding pass that I'm unaware of." His voice carried the weight of quiet authority, honed through years of commanding rooms far more hostile than this one. Rebecca stood slightly behind her superior, arms crossed tightly against her uniform. "Sir, we just need to verify that this pass belongs to you," she interjected, her voice laced with an air of suspicion that was impossible to ignore. Charles leaned forward slightly, holding their gaze with quiet intensity. "Let me guess," he said, his voice even. "You believe I don't belong here?" The older attendant shifted uncomfortably, but Rebecca held her ground, her eyes narrowing. "We have policies, Mr. Bennett," she said, hesitating slightly as she glanced at the boarding pass. "We have to be thorough." A murmur passed through the nearby passengers. Some looked away, embarrassed by the unfolding scene, while others watched with keen interest, phones subtly angled to capture the moment. Charles exhaled, forcing himself to stay composed. He reached into his inside pocket and pulled out his ID, holding it out with deliberate steadiness. "Go ahead," he said, offering it to her. "Verify all you need." Rebecca took it hesitantly, glancing between him and the ID photo. Charles could see the doubt flicker in her eyes, the small hesitation that spoke volumes. In that moment, he realized it was never just about the boarding pass. It was about him. The senior attendant cleared his throat, sensing the weight of the situation. "I'll take care of this," he said to Rebecca, gesturing for her to step aside. She hesitated, but eventually nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. Charles offered a small, knowing smile. "Take your time," he said, leaning back in his seat, eyes locking onto Rebecca's for a lingering moment. "I'm not going anywhere." Rebecca walked away stiffly, her heels clicking against the narrow aisle as she disappeared toward the front of the plane. Charles watched her retreat with quiet intensity, then turned his attention back to his phone, scrolling through a few emails he had yet to respond to. The tension in the cabin hadn't dissolved. It lingered, thick and palpable. Passengers whispered in hushed tones, their curiosity barely hidden. A middle-aged woman across the aisle glanced at Charles with a mix of sympathy and unease, offering a small smile that he acknowledged with a nod. Another passenger, a businessman in a navy suit, frowned at the unfolding situation, shaking his head in quiet disapproval. Minutes later, Rebecca returned, but this time her expression was different, tight-lipped, strained. In her hand, she held Charles's ID and boarding pass, her grip tight enough to crumple the paper slightly. "Sir," she said, her voice clipped but laced with something close to regret. "It appears everything checks out." Charles took a slow breath, nodding as he extended his hand. She returned his documents, and for a fleeting second, their fingers brushed, awkward, tense. "I could have told you that from the beginning," he said, his voice measured but with a sharp edge underneath. Rebecca opened her mouth to respond, but the senior flight attendant returned, his expression more serious than before. "Mr. Bennett," he said, clearing his throat, "on behalf of the airline, I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding." Charles studied him for a moment, noting the way his eyes darted nervously. "Misunderstanding?" Charles repeated, leaning slightly forward. "Is that what we're calling it now?" The man shifted, clearly uncomfortable under the scrutiny. "It was never our intention to make you feel unwelcome," he continued. "However, the airline has a strict policy regarding security and—" "Security?" Charles cut in, his voice low but forceful. "Tell me, was security your primary concern, or was it something else?" The senior attendant's face reddened slightly, but before he could respond, another voice joined the conversation. "Excuse me," a young woman said from across the aisle. She had her phone in hand, the screen still recording. "I've been watching this whole thing. Is this how first-class passengers are treated? Or is this something else?" Rebecca stiffened at the comment, her eyes darting to the camera. A few other passengers murmured in agreement, and Charles could feel the weight of the collective awareness settling in. "I think we both know the answer to that," Charles said calmly, his eyes never leaving Rebecca's. "But thank you for the thorough inspection." Rebecca's cheeks flushed, and she took a step back, clearly rattled. The senior attendant sighed, offering Charles another placating smile. "We'd like to offer you a complimentary upgrade for the inconvenience," he said, his voice softer now, as if hoping to smooth things over. Charles smiled faintly, shaking his head. "No need," he said, adjusting his seatbelt. "I already have what I paid for." Rebecca glanced at him once more before hurrying away, her shoulders squared but tension visible in every step. Charles exhaled, feeling the atmosphere around him shift once again. He was used to it by now, the moments of doubt, the need to constantly prove himself. But what Rebecca didn't know was that Charles had fought bigger battles than this, and he wasn't about to let one flight attendant ruin his peace. As the plane taxied down the runway, Charles leaned back, watching the clouds ahead, knowing this was just another chapter in a story far too familiar. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the tension in the cabin gradually gave way to the usual in-flight routine. The soft chime signaling the start of beverage service rang through the cabin. But for Charles, the incident lingered. He could feel the weight of lingering stares, some apologetic, others curious, and a few still skeptical. Rebecca moved down the aisle, her movements stiff and mechanical, avoiding eye contact with Charles as she served the other passengers. When she finally reached his row, her hands trembled slightly as she placed a glass of sparkling water on his tray table. "Here you go, sir," she said, her voice subdued but lacking the earlier sharpness. Charles looked up at her, studying the lines of discomfort etched across her face. He could tell she was grappling with the fallout of her actions, the growing whispers around the cabin, and perhaps even the realization that she had made a critical mistake. He took the glass and nodded. "Thank you," he said simply, his tone devoid of bitterness but heavy with meaning. Rebecca hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, clearly wanting to say more but unsure of how to proceed. Instead, she turned away quickly, retreating toward the galley. A man seated a few rows ahead turned back and offered Charles an encouraging smile. "You handled that well," he said, his voice low enough not to draw attention but sincere enough to be heard. Charles gave a polite nod. "I've learned that staying composed speaks louder than anything else." The man chuckled. "Still, it shouldn't have happened in the first place." Charles sighed, swirling the water in his glass. "No, it shouldn't have," he agreed. Meanwhile, Rebecca stood near the galley, nervously checking her watch and whispering to another flight attendant. The senior crew member, who had earlier apologized, was now speaking quietly with the captain at the cockpit door. Charles could tell something was happening, something beyond just an apology. Moments later, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came through, steady and professional. "We'd like to apologize for any inconvenience caused earlier. Please be assured that we value all of our passengers equally, and we are committed to providing the highest level of service to everyone on board." Charles arched an eyebrow at the thinly veiled attempt at damage control. The murmurs of other passengers confirmed that they, too, weren't buying the scripted apology. Then, in an unexpected turn, Rebecca was seen walking briskly toward the front of the plane, where the captain gestured for her to follow him into the galley. Charles could feel the shift. Something was about to happen. Minutes later, the door to the galley opened, and the senior crew member emerged. He approached Charles directly, offering another apologetic smile, but this time with a note of finality. "Mr. Bennett," he said, clearing his throat, "I wanted to inform you that Miss Miller will not be continuing on this flight. We take these matters very seriously." Charles leaned back slightly, taking in the news. He offered a small, knowing smile. "I hope this serves as a learning experience," he said, his voice steady but firm. The crew member nodded, clearly relieved by Charles's grace under pressure. "Absolutely, sir. And again, we apologize for any distress this may have caused." As the flight continued, Charles let out a quiet sigh of relief. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but today, at least, justice had been swift. As the plane cruised smoothly, Charles leaned back, observing the shift in the cabin's atmosphere. The tension had faded, replaced by quiet admiration and lingering whispers. A new flight attendant approached him with a warm smile. "Mr. Bennett, can I get you anything?" she asked politely. Charles shook his head. "I'm fine, thank you." His phone buzzed with a message from a colleague. "Saw what happened. You handled it with class." He sighed, knowing this moment had already reached far beyond the confines of the plane. Across the aisle, the businessman who had recognized him earlier leaned in. "I hope this makes people think," he said. Charles nodded thoughtfully. "Let's hope so." As the plane prepared for landing, Charles stood, feeling the weight of the moment. Several passengers acknowledged him with quiet nods. At the exit, the captain extended a handshake. "I'm truly sorry for what happened, Mr. Bennett." Charles met his gaze. "Just make sure it doesn't happen again." Stepping onto the jet bridge, Charles exhaled deeply. Today had been another reminder of the road still ahead, but he walked it with dignity as always. Have you ever been judged unfairly just because of how you look? Charles faced it head-on with grace and dignity. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more powerful stories that inspire and challenge perspectives.